Kate Morrison had spent her whole life making herself small, quiet heels, polite smiles, and a waitress's grace that taught her how to move unnoticed through rooms full of powerful men. But the night she set a water glass at the edge of the Billionaire's table, her invisible world cracked wide open. A glint of purple ink shone from Nathan Hewitt's arm. A purple heart, the sacred symbol of blood lost in battle, etched forever just below the sleeve of his designer suit. Key, San. 1968, Bravo Company. Kate's heart slammed against her ribs. That was her grandfather's unit, his trauma, his nightmares. She'd read those words on letters stained with tears, listened as his voice broke, describing the night he pulled dying boys from burning dirt. But Nathan was half the age he should be. The whole room blurred around Kate as one impossible truth burned through her mind. Either this billionaire was living inside her family's war, or he was stealing valor from a dying man with Alzheimer's. The Bronze Eagle's golden light fell on faces she'd served for years. Not one person noticed her trembling hands, not even as she whispered, "That tattoo doesn't belong to you." Nathan's eyes flashed with something between anger and shame. Every waiter knows the risk. Challenge a rich man, you lose your living. But for Kate, silence would mean betraying the only hero she'd ever known. In that moment, every sorrow, every bill, every goodbye tightened in her chest. She asked herself, would she stay invisible? Or would she drag the truth into the light, no matter how much it cost? Your support means everything to this channel. Subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that honor the invisible and expose the powerful. Let's begin. The Bronze Eagle smelled like 30 years of burnt coffee and blue-collar sweat. Kate moved through the banquet room the way a river moves over stones, smooth, practiced, barely noticed. She'd learned this dance years ago. Watch the water glasses. Read the body language. Anticipate the need before the demand. Tonight, the Veteran Appreciation Fundraiser had packed the place with Flagstaff's money. The tech millionaires from Phoenix, the ranching families whose names were on street signs, and Nathan Hewitt, the billionaire whose face smiled from magazine covers in grocery store checkout lines. Her coworker Donna worked the far corner, refilling bread baskets with the efficiency of someone who'd seen it all. Donna had a gift. She could read a customer's entire personality from their watch choice, their posture, the way they spoke to servers. Earlier, she'd whispered a warning to Kate near the kitchen. Table 6. Hewitt's people. They'll run you ragged and tip 8%. Kate had nodded, tucking the information away. She'd handled worse. Rich people didn't scare her anymore. She'd buried one good man and raised 2 boys on tips and grit. This was just another shift. 12 years for months, 11 days since Tom died. Kate didn't have to count anymore. Her body kept the timeline for her. The locket beneath her uniform collar pressed against her sternum like a second heartbeat. Inside were 2 photos. Tom in his army dress blues, young and whole, before the war ate him alive from the inside, and their twin sons as babies, squinting at a camera they couldn't understand yet. Agent Orange complications, the doctors had said, as if giving it a name made it hurt less. As if a name could explain why a man who survived combat came home to die slow in a hospital bed, drowning in his own lungs. She'd worked double shifts to keep the boys fed, breakfast service until 2, then back for dinner until closing. Pride had kept her from taking the veterans' widow benefits at first. She wanted to prove she could stand on her own 2 feet, that she didn't need anyone's pity. But medical bills didn't care about pride. Eventually, she'd filled out the forms with shaking hands, each signature feeling like an admission of defeat. In her locker, pushed behind her spare apron and a tattered paperback, sat the one thing she'd never sell, never lose. Her grandfather's Purple Heart certificate. She'd inherited it 5 years ago when his Alzheimer's got bad enough that memory care was the only option left. The frame was cheap, $10 at a drugstore, but the document inside was priceless. Sergeant James Jimmy Morrison, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 26 Marines. Wounded at Key San, February 1968. The paper had yellowed at the edges, the ink fading in places, but every word was burned into her memory. That certificate was proof. Proof that her grandfather had been brave. Proof that he'd mattered. Proof that someone somewhere had seen what he'd sacrificed. Nathan Hewitt arrived the way powerful men always do, like the room had been waiting for him. His suit was tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been grown on his body rather than sewn. The watch on his wrist caught the light. Steel and sapphire, probably worth 6 months of Kate's rent. 2 security personnel flanked him, their eyes scanning exits, their hands never far from their jackets. Kate had seen enough action movies to recognize the stance. Nathan spoke to the room with rehearsed humility, his voice carrying that practiced tone of someone who'd learned how to sound humble without actually being humble. He talked about his father's military service, about sacrifice, about honoring those who served. The room nodded along, polite applause rippling through the crowd like programmed response. But Kate noticed what others missed. The way Nathan's fingers traced the tattoo on his forearm when he thought no one was looking, like he was checking to make sure it was still there. The worn edge of a photograph visible in his wallet when he pulled out his credit card. The wedding ring on his right hand instead of his left, widower, she guessed, or divorced and still mourning. His phone wallpaper flashed for half a second before he swiped it away. A graying man in military fatigues, eyes tired, smile forced. Nathan's face when he looked at that photo held something Kate recognized instantly. Grief. The kind that doesn't fade, just changes shape. She knew that look. She saw it in the mirror every morning. Just water, no ice, Nathan said without looking up. His eyes stayed fixed on his phone, his tone dismissing her before she'd even finished pouring. It wasn't rude exactly, just the casual erasure wealthy people performed on service workers without even knowing they were doing it. Kate's grip on the pitcher tightened, but her face stayed smooth. She'd learned a long time ago that showing emotion cost tips. Donna caught her eye from across the room, one eyebrow raised in a silent question. You good? Kate nodded slightly. She was fine. She'd handled worse than being invisible. Donna had watched Kate work for 8 years, through Tom's final hospitalization, through the boys leaving for college, through her grandfather's slow disappearance into the fog of Alzheimer's. She'd never seen Kate's composure slip, not once. Not when a drunk customer grabbed her wrist. Not when a teenager threw a milkshake in her face over a wrong order. Not when her car broke down and she had to walk 4 miles to work in the snow. Kate was stone, unshakable. But when Nathan reached for his water glass and his sleeve rode up, something shifted in Kate's expression. Her eyes locked on his forearm. The tattoo. Detailed ink rendered in purple and gold. A perfect replica of the Purple Heart Medal. And beneath it, words in precise script. Keys in 1968. Bravo Company 126 Marines. The water pitcher trembled in her hands. That unit designation. That exact year. That specific battle. It couldn't be coincidence. It couldn't be. Nathan's phone rang, the screen flashing VA Records Office in blocky letters. Kate's pulse quickened. She'd spent years navigating the labyrinth of the Veterans Administration, first for Tom's disability claims, then for her grandfather's benefits, then for the endless paperwork that came with memory care placement. She knew that system inside and out. The hold music bleeding through Nathan's phone speaker was unmistakable. The same tinny instrumental loop she'd listened to for hundreds of hours, phone pressed to her ear while she waited for anyone, to acknowledge that her family's sacrifice mattered. Nathan muttered frustration under his breath, stabbing at his phone screen. 3rd time this week. Can't get through to the right department. His jaw tightened. My father's service records should be simple to access. Kate set down the water pitcher with deliberate care. Her voice came out quiet, almost apologetic. Extension 4477, she said. Nathan's head snapped up. What? Vietnam Era Records Department. Extension 4477. Ask for FOIA request status. They'll transfer you directly. Saves about 40 minutes of hold time. Nathan stared at her, surprise replacing the dismissive glaze in his eyes. How do you? Experience, Kate said simply. She pulled the red pen from her apron pocket, the same pen she'd used to annotate her grandfather's war letters, creating a timeline that helped the doctors diagnose his PTSD before the Alzheimer's made everything else irrelevant. She clicked it once, a nervous habit. Nathan watched her walk away, his expression shifting from condescension to curiosity. Rent was due in 6 days. $480 she didn't have yet. Her grandfather's memory care facility had raised rates again, another $150 a month starting next week. Her own doctor appointments kept getting postponed because the copays were $60 she couldn't spare. Confronting a billionaire during the diner's most important fundraiser could cost everything. Her job, her reputation, any chance of picking up extra shifts to cover the shortfall. But that tattoo, that impossible, too specific tattoo with her grandfather's unit designation inked permanently into a stranger's skin. She couldn't let it go. She wouldn't. Dessert service arrived with the ritual precision of wealth. Creme brulee in individual ramekins, each one torch to caramelize perfection. Kate moved between tables, setting down plates while the guests barely registered her presence. Nathan's business partner, a silver-haired man with the kind of tan that came from ski vacations, leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone about to make an important point. "This veteran hiring initiative needs authentication," he said, loud enough to draw the table's attention. "We need real stories, real service records." Nathan nodded, his expression shifting into that public-facing sincerity he wore so well. "My father served with the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines at Khe Sanh," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "One of the bloodiest sieges of the Vietnam War." The room murmured its respectful acknowledgement, nods, soft words of appreciation, the kind of validation that came easy when you didn't have to earn it with your own blood. Kate's hands shook as she set down the last plate. The espresso machine behind the bar hissed like a cornered animal, steam screaming through metal, and her pulse matched its rhythm exactly. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't. The words came up from somewhere deep, from the place where grief and loyalty lived together in her chest. "Bravo Company?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. Nathan's head turned slowly toward her, his brow furrowing. "What?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Bravo Company. Was your father in Bravo Company?" Nathan frowned, confusion and irritation warring on his face. "Yes." "Why?" "My grandfather served in Bravo Company," Kate said, louder this time, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Same siege. February 1968. The table fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks stopped moving. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Nathan's expression shifted, defensive at first, then calculating, his jaw tightening as he processed what she'd said. "Many men served there," he said dismissively, his tone sharpening into something cold. "Thousands of Marines rotated through Khe Sanh." He leaned back in his chair, creating distance. "Your grandfather's name?" Kate lifted her chin, meeting his eyes directly. "Sergeant James Morrison, Radio Operator Rescue. February 25th, 1968. Nathan's face went pale. The color drained so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. Nathan recovered quickly, his expression snapping back into controlled neutrality like a mask sliding into place. "Ma'am, I appreciate your grandfather's service," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "But there were thousands of Marines at Khe Sanh during the siege." He spread his hands in a gesture meant to be conciliatory, but came off as patronizing. It's not uncommon for families to conflate stories or misremember details after so many years. The implication hung in the air. She was confused, mistaken, perhaps even delusional. The business partner nodded sympathetically, already dismissing her. Kate pulled the red pen from her apron pocket, the one she'd carried for years. "May I borrow a napkin?" she asked, her voice calm. Nathan hesitated, then pushed one across the table toward her. She clicked the pen once and began to sketch. Her hand moved with confidence, muscle memory guiding the lines. The base layout emerged in precise detail. The airstrip running east to west, the ammunition dump on the north side, the perimeter bunkers marked with small circles, the trench systems radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. February 25th, 1968. 0340 hours, she said quietly, not looking up from the napkin. Bunker Complex Alpha. 3 took a direct hit during early morning bombardment. She marked an X on the sketch. 3 men trapped in the collapsed communications trench. She looked up, reading the micro-expressions flickering across Nathan's face. Surprise, defensiveness, and beneath it all, recognition. Your father, she paused, deliberately, watching his pupils dilate slightly. Was one of them? Nathan's security team moved closer, their bodies tensing, hands drifting toward their jackets. Nathan raised one hand sharply, stopping them without taking his eyes off Kate. How could you possibly know that? He whispered. His voice had lost its edge, replaced by something raw. My grandfather wrote everything down, Kate said. Every detail, every name he could remember, before the memories disappeared. She set the pen down carefully. The radio operator's call sign was Whiskey 9. Nathan's breath caught audibly. The communications trench collapsed at 0340, but the main bombardment didn't start until 0355. My grandfather had 18 minutes to dig 3 men out before the artillery started again. She recited the details with the precision of someone who'd read the same letters 1,000 times. He pulled the first man out at 0347, the second at 0351, the third, the youngest one, the radio operator, at 0357 2 minutes before the next wave hit. Nathan's hand covered his mouth, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He saved 3 men that night, Kate continued, her voice softening. One of them was 18 years old, a radio operator from Tennessee. She watched Nathan's face crumple slightly, watched him fight to maintain composure. My father was from Knoxville, Nathan said, his voice cracking on the last word. The room held its breath. Gerald Finch materialized at Kate's elbow like a shadow she hadn't noticed forming. Mrs. Morrison, he said, his voice tight with forced politeness. Can I speak with you? It wasn't a question. His grip on her arm was firm enough to leave marks, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow. He steered her toward the kitchen, smiling apologetically at the tables they passed, playing the role of concerned manager addressing a minor staff issue. The kitchen door swung shut behind them, cutting off the dining room's murmur. Gerald's face transformed the moment they were alone. The polite mask dissolved into naked fury. What the hell do you think you're doing? He hissed, his face inches from hers. Disrupting VIP guests, jeopardizing fundraiser, overstepping every boundary we have. Spit flew from his lips as he spoke. That man could buy this place 10 times over. You embarrassed him publicly in front of his business associates. Kate's jaw tightened, her teeth grinding together. I embarrassed him by knowing the truth, she said quietly. Gerald's eyes narrowed. You embarrassed him by making yourself the center of attention when you should have been invisible. The real agenda clicked into place for Kate in that moment. Gerald's panic wasn't about propriety or professionalism. Nathan Hewitt had promised a major donation, $250,000, to expand the Bronze Eagle into a veterans community center. Gerald had spent months cultivating this relationship, playing the humble small business owner who cared about veterans. Any conflict, any discomfort could kill the deal. You finish your shift in the kitchen, Gerald said, his voice dropping to something venomous. Away from the guests, away from Mr. Hewitt, away from anyone who matters. He reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone. Policy during VIP events, he said, though they both knew no such policy existed. You'll get this back at the end of your shift. He pocketed her phone and walked out, leaving Kate standing alone next to the industrial dishwasher. Nathan pulled out his phone with shaking hands. The dessert sat untouched in front of him, caramelized sugar cooling into something hard and inedible. Find everything on James Morrison, he said into the phone, his voice low and urgent. Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, Keys and Siege. I need it in the next 10 minutes. His assistant, a woman who'd worked for him for 8 years and knew when not to ask questions, went silent for 3 seconds. I'm on it, she said. The information came faster than Nathan expected. VA records, historical rosters, casualty reports pulled from military archives. Sergeant James Morrison's name appeared in all of them, consistent across every source. Wounded in action, February 25, 1968. Purple Heart citation. Awarded March 1968. Meritorious Conduct Commendation for rescue operation under enemy fire. The official description stated he'd pulled 3 men from a collapsed bunker during artillery bombardment, sustaining shrapnel wounds to his left shoulder and back in the process. The date matched. The location matched. The description matched his father's story exactly. Nathan's breath came short, his chest tightening. His father had told that story 100 times before dying 3 years ago from complications related to exposure to Agent Orange. He described the darkness, the weight of dirt and sandbags pressing down on his chest, the certainty that he was going to die at 18 years old in a hole in Vietnam. He talked about the sergeant who dug with his bare hands, who'd pulled him out 2 minutes before the next artillery barrage hit. But in all those tellings, his father had never remembered the rescuer's name, only that he'd been a sergeant from Arizona with steady hands and a voice that stayed calm even when the world was exploding around them. Cross-reference Catherine Morrison Flagstaff, Nathan said. The results came back clean. Widowed 12 years ago. One grandfather in memory care, James Morrison, age 89. 2 adult sons. Spotless work history. 8 years at the Bronze Eagle, 6 years at another diner before that. No criminal record. No litigation history. No social media presence demanding attention or validation. Just a waitress protecting her grandfather's legacy. Nathan found Kate in the kitchen 15 minutes later, her hands submerged in soapy water, drying dishes with mechanical precision. "I owe you an apology," he said from the doorway. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge his presence. Her shoulders stayed rigid, her movement steady. "My father died 3 years ago," Nathan continued, stepping closer. He talked about that night, about the sergeant who saved him, until the day he died. But he never knew his name, never could remember it. The trauma erased that detail. Kate's hands stilled in the soapy water, suds clinging to her wrists. "My grandfather has Alzheimer's," she said quietly. "He doesn't remember the war anymore. Doesn't remember his own name most days." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Nathan stepped closer, not threatening, not crowding, just present. "I got this tattoo to honor the man who gave me my father," he said, rolling up his sleeve to fully reveal the purple heart ink. "My entire existence is because of what your grandfather did that night." Kate finally turned to face him, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Then why didn't you believe me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His cologne, cedar, and old money, mixed with the smell of dish soap and her exhaustion, creating a strange alchemy in the small space between them. Nathan held her gaze. "Because wealthy people don't expect working people to know more than them," he said, the honesty landing like a confession. "Because I've spent so long being right that I forgot how to listen." The kitchen hummed around them, the dishwasher's cycle ending with a soft click. If you're feeling what Kate's feeling right now, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The voice came from behind them, gravelly and worn smooth by 7 decades of living. "I served with the 26th Marines." Kate and Nathan both turned to find an elderly man standing there, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his eyes sharp despite the wrinkles that framed them. He wore a faded Marine Corps cap and a windbreaker that had seen better years. "Walter Hayes," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Not Bravo Company, Charlie Company. But I was there. Key-san. The whole damn siege." Walter had overheard their conversation from 3 tables away. At 76 years old, his hearing wasn't what it used to be, but certain words still cut through any amount of noise. Key-san, Bravo Company, February 1968. Those words lived in his bones. He pulled out a chair without asking and sat down, his movement slow but deliberate. "Let me tell you something about your grandfather, young lady," he said, looking directly at Kate. His eyes held the particular sadness of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. Walter described the key and siege the way only someone who'd lived it could. The chaos that made time meaningless. The terror of artillery bombardments that came without warning, turning the air itself into shrapnel. The way you learned to tell the difference between incoming and outgoing rounds by sound alone, and how that knowledge was the difference between life and death. The impossible heroism of men like Sergeant Morrison who moved through hell like it was just another day at work. "Your grandfather saved more than 3 men that night, young lady," Walter said, his voice dropping lower. "He stabilized the communications network for the entire western perimeter." Kate's eyes widened, her breath catching. Her grandfather had never mentioned that detail. Never said anything about communications networks or perimeters. He'd only talked about pulling boys from the dirt, about hands that wouldn't stop shaking for days afterward. Walter turned to Nathan, his expression softening slightly. Your father was the radio operator who called in air support that saved 200 Marines the next morning, he said. February 26th, 0600 hours. Airstrike on enemy positions that were preparing to overrun Hill 861-inch. Nathan's hand went to his mouth, covering the emotion threatening to break through. Because Sergeant Morrison kept him alive, Walter finished. Because one man dug through hell to save 3 others, 200 more got to go home. The weight of intergenerational debt settled between them like something physical, something with mass and gravity. Walter reached across the table and took Kate's flour-dusted hand in both of his. His palms were rough, scarred from decades of manual labor after the war. I buried 3 friends at Key San, he said quietly. Good men, boys really, 18, 19 years old. Survivors carried them forward. Your grandfather did. Now you do. Gerald Finch watched the scene unfold from across the dining room, his jaw tightening with each passing moment. This was spinning out of control. What should have been a simple, profitable evening. Wealthy donors eating expensive food, writing checks, validating his vision for the diner's expansion, had turned into some kind of impromptu memorial service. And at the center of it all was Kate Morrison, the woman he paid $12 an hour to be invisible. He made his move while Nathan was distracted, listening to Walter's war stories. Gerald positioned himself near Nathan's business partner and security team, his face arranged into an expression of concerned professionalism. I need to speak with Mr. Hewitt privately, he said, his tone suggesting urgent business. When Nathan excused himself and stepped away for the table, Gerald was ready. Mr. Hewitt, I apologize for the disruption this evening, he began, his voice low and confidential. I feel obligated to inform you about Mrs. Morrison's history here. The story Gerald spun was masterful in its construction, just enough truth woven through the lies to make it plausible. He talked about Kate's pattern of boundary violations with wealthy customers, her emotional instability following her husband's death, her tendency to insert herself into conversations above her station. He suggested, with carefully calibrated concern, that she might be exploiting Nathan's grief for financial gain. I've seen this before, Gerald said, shaking his head sadly. People in her position sometimes develop attachments to successful patrons. It can become problematic. Gerald produced a folder from behind the host stand. Written warnings he'd printed that afternoon on fake letterhead, backdated to create a paper trail that didn't exist. 3 separate incidents with other wealthy customers, he said, showing Nathan pages filled with official-looking text. Harassment complaints, boundary violations, inappropriate emotional appeals. The documents looked legitimate. Dates, witness signatures, HR language. Nathan's business instincts kicked in immediately. He'd built a tech empire worth billions by never taking information at face value, by always digging deeper, by trusting verification over assertion. Show me dates and witnesses, he said, his voice cooling by several degrees. I want to speak with the people who filed these complaints. Gerald stammered, his prepared script collapsing under scrutiny. Well, they're no longer employed here, but names, Nathan interrupted. Give me their names, and I'll find them myself. Donna had been watching from the kitchen doorway, her instincts honed by 8 years of working under Gerald's management. She'd seen him pull this kind of thing before, manufacturing problems, creating paper trails, sacrificing employees to protect his interests. She stepped forward before Gerald could respond. Those complaints are fake, she said loudly enough that nearby tables turned to look. Kate's worked here 8 years. Never a single complaint. Not 1 inch. She looked directly at Nathan. Gerald's lying because he's terrified of losing your donation. Nathan's expression hardened, the temperature in his eyes dropping to something arctic. Is that true, Gerald? The diner owner's face reddened, splotches of color rising from his collar to his receding hairline. I'm protecting my business, he said, his voice rising defensively. Nathan took a step closer, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that could cut steel. By slandering a woman whose grandfather saved my father's life. The room's energy shifted, conversations dying as people sensed the confrontation. Nathan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I want to see your grandfather's letters," he said to Kate. She hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. Those letters were private, sacred. The last connection to the man her grandfather used to be before Alzheimer's stole him away. But something in Nathan's expression, earnest, almost pleading, made her nod. "They're in my locker," she said quietly. She retrieved them carefully, carrying the worn shoebox like it contained something fragile and infinitely precious. Because it did. 43 letters, each one preserved in a clear plastic sleeve, protected from the degradation of time and handling. She'd annotated them with her red pen over the years, dates cross-referenced with historical records, locations verified through VA documents, names researched until she'd built a complete timeline of her grandfather's service. The box also contained the Purple Heart certificate. It's framed cheap, but the document inside priceless. Nathan sat down at an empty table and began to read. His hands trembled as he turned each page, careful not to damage the aging paper. The handwriting was cramped, the product of a young man writing by firelight in a combat zone. The dates matched his father's stories exactly. January 21st, 1968. The siege begins. February 5th. Hill 860-1A attacked. February 7th. Langvay overrun. February 25th. The bunker collapse. The rescue. The moment that connected their families across 5 decades. The details aligned with everything Nathan had researched, every VA record he'd pulled, every historical account he'd read. But one letter stopped him cold. February 28, 1968, written 3 days after the rescue. The text described the ongoing bombardment, the constant terror, the friends lost. But at the bottom, folded carefully into the envelope, was something extraordinary, a hand-drawn map of the base. Not a simple sketch, but a detailed, tactical rendering showing the airstrip, the ammunition dumps, the perimeter bunkers, the trench systems. And scattered across it, written in the same cramped handwriting, were notations about weaknesses in the perimeter defense, gaps in the wire, bunkers with inadequate overhead cover, trenches that flooded during rain, sight lines compromised by terrain. "This is tactical intelligence," Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible. Walter Hayes leaned over to look, his eyes widening with recognition. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. He pulled reading glasses from his pocket and examined the map more closely. "Morrison identified the vulnerability on the western perimeter," he said, his finger tracing one of the notations. "The gap between Bunker 6 and Bunker 7. That's where the NVA tried to breach during the March offensive." He looked up at Kate with something like awe. This map might have saved hundreds of lives. If command saw this, if they reinforced those positions. Kate stared at the letter, at the map she'd seen 1,000 times, but never truly understood. She thought it was just her grandfather documenting what he saw, processing his trauma through detailed observation. She'd never realized he'd been doing reconnaissance, identifying tactical vulnerabilities, trying to keep his fellow Marines alive. The Purple Heart certificate in her locker wasn't just family memorabilia. It was documentation of strategic heroism that had gone unrecognized for 57 years. Nathan made a decision, his business mind shifting into action mode. "These letters belong in the National Archives," he said, looking at Kate with an intensity that demanded honesty. "This is history. This is documentation of heroism that needs to be preserved, studied, honored." He paused, softening slightly. "With your permission." Kate nodded, overwhelmed, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her best efforts to contain them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, he'd want that." The October storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke with biblical intensity. Rain hammered the diner's windows like artillery fire, lightning cracking the sky into fragments of white light. Within minutes, the roads became impassable. Flash flood warnings screamed from phones, and the county sheriff's department issued a shelter-in-place advisory. The fundraiser guests were trapped, wealthy people suddenly rendered powerless by weather that didn't care about their net worth. Nathan and Kate sat in a corner booth, away from the other guests. The letters spread across the table between them like a bridge across decades. Gerald fumed from across the room, his face dark with impotent rage. But he couldn't do anything now. Not with Walter Hayes watching him like a hawk. Not with Donna documenting everything. Not with Nathan Hewitt's security team positioned between him and Kate. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Vulnerable dialogue emerged in the forced intimacy of the storm. Nathan spoke first, his voice stripped of the polished veneer he usually wore. "My father was a machinist after the war," he said, staring at his hands. "Worked 3 jobs to send me to Stanford. He never talked about Keys, and except that one story. The sergeant who pulled him from darkness." He traced the tattoo on his forearm absently. "He told it at my high school graduation, at my wedding, the day my first company went public. Like he wanted me to remember where I came from." Kate's voice was softer, weighted with years of grief. "My grandfather came home and never left Arizona," she said. "He married my grandmother in 1969, raised my mother, worked construction for 40 years. She touched one of the letters gently. "The PTSD didn't show until he was 70. By then we thought it was just old age making him forgetful, irritable." Her voice cracked slightly. "The Alzheimer's diagnosis came 2 years later. Now, he doesn't remember any of it." Nathan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I built a tech empire and forgot where I came from," he admitted. "This tattoo was supposed to remind me, but I stopped really seeing it. It became just decoration. Think." The honesty in his voice was raw. Kate met his eyes. "My grandfather is dying," she said simply. "I wanted him to know someone remembered, that his sacrifice mattered to someone beyond our family." Nathan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The gesture was comfort, not romance. Shared grief and gratitude. 2 strangers connected by a debt 57 years old. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the booth, something quiet and profound settled between them. Recognition, understanding, the weight of legacy acknowledged and shared. Donna approached their booth with hesitant steps, her usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. She carried a cup of coffee she didn't drink, just held it for the warmth. "Can I tell you something?" she asked quietly. Kate nodded, making space at the table. Donna sat down slowly, her eyes distant with memory. "My father served in Vietnam too," she said. "Different unit, different year, but same war, same poison." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He died from exposure-related cancer when I was 12. Agent Orange," they said, though they fought the claim for 6 years. She looked at Kate with an intensity that made her words land heavy. "I've watched you honor your family for 8 years, Donna said. "You paid for Mrs. Patterson's insulin 6 times when her Medicare ran out. You drove Mr. Chin to dialysis twice a week for 2 years. You covered Maria's rent when her husband left." Her voice strengthened. "You never asked for credit, never mentioned it, just served." Other customers and staff began to gather, drawn by the truth being spoken. They offered their own testimony about Kate's quiet dignity. The regular whose car she'd helped fix, the single mother whose child care emergency she'd solved, the elderly veteran whose groceries she'd paid for countless times. The community validation was spontaneous and powerful, each voice adding weight to the truth Gerald had tried to bury. Walter Hayes stood, his cane tapping against the floor. "The best of us don't seek recognition," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "They just serve." The storm had passed by morning, leaving Flagstaff washed clean and cold under October skies. Kate returned to work the next day with a fragile hope settling in her chest. Nathan had promised to help. Walter Hayes had validated her grandfather's heroism. The community had rallied around her. Maybe for once, standing up for the truth wouldn't cost her everything. She was wrong. Gerald Finch had spent the night after the storm on the phone with his lawyer, a man named Raymond Pierce, who specialized in what he called reputation management for small businesses. Pierce was expensive, ruthless, and very good at his job. Together, they'd crafted a strategy designed to destroy Kate before she could destroy Gerald's chances at Nathan's donation. The best defense, Pierce had advised, was a scorched earth offense. By noon, Gerald had filed a formal complaint with the Flagstaff Police Department claiming Kate had engaged in harassment of a patron and creation of a hostile environment for guests. He fabricated witness statements from 3 customers, who'd allegedly observed Kate's aggressive and inappropriate behavior toward Mr. Hewitt. The statements were detailed, specific, and completely false. But they looked official on letterhead, signed and dated, presented with the confidence of truth. By 2 p.m., Pierce had sent cease and desist letters to both Kate and Nathan. The letter to Nathan threatened a lawsuit for tortious interference with business operations if he withdrew the promised donation or continued contact with Kate. The letter to Kate demanded the immediate return of all letters, claiming they were diner property, since she'd accessed her locker on premises during work hours. The legal theory was absurd, but it didn't need to hold up in court. It just needed to terrify a waitress who couldn't afford a lawyer. Kate received her letter at 3:47 p.m., hand-delivered by a courier who made her sign for it. Her hands shook as she read the dense legal language, each paragraph a new threat. Immediate termination of employment. Defamation claims seeking damages of $50,000. Financial liability for theft of proprietary materials. Criminal harassment charges that could result in arrest. The words blurred together, terror making it hard to focus. Gerald had positioned himself as the victim, a small business owner trying to protect his employees and guests from an unstable woman with boundary issues. Nathan was cast as the manipulated donor, a wealthy man taken advantage of by someone exploiting his grief. And Kate was the scheming opportunist, a bitter widow inventing connections to famous people for attention and money. Without her phone, still confiscated in Gerald's office, she couldn't contact Nathan, couldn't call Donna for support, couldn't reach her sons to tell them what was happening. She stood in the employee break room, the letter trembling in her hands, feeling the walls close in around her. She'd worked for 12 years to keep her head above water, worked through grief, through exhaustion, through the slow death of her grandfather's mind. And in one night, one moment of standing up for what was right, she'd lost everything. The isolation was calculated and complete. Gerald had cut her off from allies, weaponized the law against her, and made her feel small and helpless and utterly alone. She thought about running, thought about packing her car and disappearing, starting over somewhere else where no one knew her story. But she was 57 years old with arthritis in her knees and a grandfather dying in a memory care facility she couldn't afford to abandon. There was nowhere to run. The call came at 4:15 p.m. from a number Kate didn't recognize. She answered with shaking hands, hoping it was Nathan, hoping for rescue. Instead, a woman's voice, professional, cool, efficient, identified herself as Nathan Hewitt's executive assistant. "I'm calling to cancel tomorrow's planned meeting with Mr. Morrison," she said. No preamble, no explanation, just the cold efficiency of someone managing a billionaire schedule. Kate's heart dropped into her stomach, her vision narrowing at the edges. "Cancel," she whispered. The assistant's tone remained neutral, carefully calibrated to reveal nothing. "Mr. Hewitt asked me to convey that due to legal complications, he won't be able to proceed with the visit at this time." Legal complications. The words felt like a punch. "He also wanted me to express his appreciation for your grandfather's service." The line went dead before Kate could respond. She stood in the break room, phone still pressed to her ear, and felt something inside her crack. Of course the billionaire would protect himself. Of course money and lawyers and reputation would matter more than truth. She'd been stupid to believe otherwise. Nathan Hewitt lived in a different world, a world where $50,000 lawsuits were annoying inconveniences, not life-destroying catastrophes. He could afford to walk away. She couldn't. Kate walked to her locker on autopilot, her body moving while her mind spun in circles of panic and betrayal. She packed slowly, methodically, each item a small defeat. Her spare apron, folded with the precision of someone who'd served tables for 30 years. The paperback novel she'd been reading on breaks for 3 months. The Purple Heart certificate, still in its cheap drugstore frame, the glass cracked now from being shoved against other items. The weight of it felt heavier than before, like the glass crack had somehow made the sacrifice it represented more fragile. She almost discarded the red pen, almost threw it in the trash along with her employee handbook and name tag. But her hand hesitated. That pen had annotated 43 letters, had created a timeline that proved her grandfather's story. had documented truth in a way that couldn't be fabricated after the fact. It was evidence. Evidence of what she didn't know anymore. But something in her couldn't let it go. What Kate didn't know, what she couldn't know, isolated and terrified, was that Nathan wasn't abandoning her. He was mobilizing. While she packed her locker, he was on conference calls with 3 law firms, demanding they pull every record on Gerald Finch and the Bronze Eagle Diner. While she read and reread the cease and desist letter, he was contacting the National Archives, arranging authentication for her grandfather's letters with an urgency that bypassed months of normal bureaucratic process. While she believed she was alone, he was reaching out to military historians, veteran advocacy groups, and journalists who specialized in stories of working-class heroism buried under decades of silence. He was gathering evidence, building a case, preparing to go to war. But billionaires fought differently than waitresses. They had time, money, and power on their side. They didn't have to explain themselves to anyone. And in that gap of information, in that silence, Kate felt her hope die. The evidence started assembling itself like a puzzle no one had realized they were building. Kate's red pen annotations became the first critical piece. Nathan's legal team had photographed every page of the 43 letters before returning them to Kate's custody. And what they found was devastating to Gerald's claims. Each annotation was dated. Not just dated casually, but precisely month, day, year, written in blue ink that had faded differently depending on how old it was. The oldest annotations went back 7 years. Kate had been cross-referencing her grandfather's letters with VA records, historical accounts, and military rosters since 2018, long before Nathan Hewitt's name ever appeared in connection with the Bronze Eagle. Gerald's claim that she'd fabricated the letters or manufactured a connection to exploit Nathan's visit was provably false. The timeline existed independent of any knowledge of Nathan. A forensic document examiner Nathan hired, the same expert who authenticated signatures for museum acquisitions, confirmed the ink aging patterns were consistent with the dates Kate had written. She'd been preserving her grandfather's legacy for years, quietly and without audience, before Gerald's greed brought her story into conflict with power. The second piece came from Donna. She showed up at Nathan's hotel on the 3rd day after the storm, carrying her phone and a USB drive with 2 years of audio recordings. She'd started recording her shifts after Gerald made increasingly inappropriate comments to female staff members. Comments that walked the line between unprofessional and actionable, but created an environment of constant low-level harassment. She'd never reported it officially because she needed the job, needed the health insurance, needed the schedule flexibility that let her care for her aging mother. But she documented everything. The recordings proved multiple things Gerald had denied. They captured him confiscating Kate's phone without legitimate cause. They documented him fabricating the policy about phones during VIP events, a policy that didn't exist in any employee handbook or training material. They recorded his conversation with Nathan's business partner where he explicitly stated his only concern was protecting the donation, not guest safety or employee conduct. Most damning, they caught Gerald coaching another employee on what to say if anyone asked about Kate's behavior, literally scripting false testimony. The third piece required more digging, but Nathan's investigators were thorough and well compensated. They found 2 former Bronze Eagle employees who'd been fired under similar circumstances. Women who'd caught the attention of wealthy male customers in ways that made Gerald nervous about his carefully cultivated relationships. One had been terminated after a tech investor complained she'd been too familiar when she mentioned they'd attended the same college. Another had been let go after suggesting a regular customer might want to support a local veterans charity. Both terminations had come with vague accusations of boundary violations and unprofessional conduct. Neither woman had fought back. They couldn't afford lawyers, couldn't risk bad references, couldn't navigate a system designed to protect employers over employees. But they could testify. And when Nathan's lawyers approached them with offers of legal representation and protection from retaliation, they agreed. The pattern was clear. Gerald Finch had a documented history of sacrificing female employees to protect relationships with wealthy male donors. He'd done it before. He'd do it again. The only thing that had changed was that this time he targeted someone whose story connected to a billionaire who actually cared. The evidence pile grew from substantial to insurmountable. Employment records, audio documentation, pattern evidence, expert testimony. And at the center of it all, 43 letters annotated with a red pen. Proof that truth existed before profit tried to bury it. Walter Hayes made the first call from his kitchen table at 6 a.m., his arthritic fingers struggling with the phone's small buttons. He reached out to Tommy Nguyen first, another key, sent survivor who lived in Phoenix and still attended monthly VA meetings. "We've got a problem," Walter said without preamble. "One of ours is under attack." Tommy listened to the whole story, then made 3 calls of his own. By noon, the network had activated. Within 48 hours, 7 key sent survivors had contacted Nathan directly, offering testimony about Sergeant Morrison's heroism. 3 had served in Bravo Company. 2 remembered the February 25th bunker collapse specifically. 1 had a letter from Morrison in his own collection, written 2 weeks after the rescue, describing the same events Kate's grandfather had documented. Their testimony wasn't just supportive, it was corroborating evidence from independent sources who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by involving themselves in a legal battle. The local VFW chapter moved next. Commander Sarah Chun, a Gulf War veteran who dealt with her share of bureaucratic injustice, drafted a public statement supporting Kate. The statement was carefully legally vetted, but unambiguous. The VFW stands with all veterans and their families who fight to preserve the truth of sacrifice. They sent copies to every local media outlet, posted it on social media, and delivered a printed version to Gerald Finch's office. The message was clear: attack one veteran's family, you attack all of them. Donna organized the diner staff with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. She called an emergency meeting at her apartment, inviting every Bronze Eagle employee except Gerald's 2 assistant managers. 12 people showed up. She laid out what Gerald had done, what he was threatening, and what it meant for all of them. "If he can do this to Kate, he can do it to any of us," she said. "The next time one of us inconveniences a rich customer, we're gone." They drafted a letter of their own. 12 signatures. One unified message. If Gerald fired or retaliated against Kate, they all walked. Every server, every cook, every dishwasher. They'd shut down the Bronze Eagle completely, and they make sure everyone in Flagstaff knew why. It was a kind of collective action that terrified small business owners, organized labor without a union, workers who'd discovered their power. The most unexpected ally came from an elderly woman named Eleanor Patterson, the regular customer whose insulin Kate had quietly paid for 6 times over 3 years. Mrs. Patterson was 82 years old, living on Social Security and a small pension. She couldn't afford a lawyer, but her grandson could. Marcus Patterson was a civil rights attorney in Phoenix who specialized in employment discrimination cases. When his grandmother called him crying about that sweet waitress who's being destroyed by a greedy man, Marcus cleared his schedule. He took Kate's case pro bono, not because it was high profile or potentially lucrative, but because his grandmother had taught him that you defend people who defend others. Within 24 hours of being retained, Marcus had filed counterclaims against Gerald for wrongful termination, defamation, and retaliation against an employee who'd engaged in protected activity. The legal landscape shifted again. The community coalition represented every generation. Veterans in their 70s who'd survived hell and refused to watch a fellow Marine's granddaughter get buried. Middle-aged workers who'd spent decades being invisible and were tired of it. Young activists drawn to a story of class injustice and collective action. Walter Hayes stood in Kate's living room 3 days after the cease and desist letter arrived and delivered the message they'd all agreed on. "I'm 76 years old," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I've watched this country bury good people for decades. People who served, people who sacrificed, people who told the truth when lying would have been easier." He looked directly at Kate. "Not this time. Not you." Nathan arranged the meeting with the precision of someone who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals. The Bronze Eagle's main dining room. Tuesday morning, 9 a.m., when the diner was normally closed for cleaning. Neutral territory that was also Gerald's domain. A deliberate choice designed to strip away any excuse about inconvenience or intimidation. Gerald would be there with his lawyer, Raymond Pierce. Kate would attend with Marcus Patterson. Nathan would bring his own legal team, 3 attorneys from a firm that specialized in employment law and civil rights litigation. Walter Hayes would be present as a witness. Donna would represent the staff, and a court reporter would document every word. The morning of the meeting, Kate stood in her bedroom, staring at her closet. She pulled out the black blazer she'd kept wrapped in plastic for 12 years, the one she'd worn to Tom's funeral, the one she'd sworn she'd never need again. The fabric still fit perfectly across her shoulders, still fell to just the right length. She'd survived widowhood in this blazer, survived burying the only man she'd ever loved while their twin sons stood stone-faced on either side of her. She'd survived financial devastation, her grandfather's slow disappearance into Alzheimer's, and a decade of making herself small enough to fit into other people's comfort. This was just another table to serve, another performance of competence and dignity in the face of people who thought her worthless. She'd done it for 30 years. She could do it one more time. Gerald arrived at 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes early, projecting confidence. He wore his best suit, the navy one he saved for loan applications and business meetings. Raymond Pierce walked beside him carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with documents, the fabricated witness statements, the fake complaints, the legal theories that didn't need to be sound, just intimidating enough to force settlement. Gerald believed his legal maneuvering had secured victory. He'd isolated Kate, terrified her, made her feel powerless. In his experience, that was enough. He didn't know about the evidence, didn't know about the recordings, the timeline, the pattern documentation, or the coalition that had formed while he celebrated what he thought was a win. He walked into the Bronze Eagle that Tuesday morning like a man attending a surrender. He had no idea he was walking into an execution. The Bronze Eagle's dining room had been transformed into something between a courtroom and a confessional. Tables pushed aside, chairs arranged in rows facing a single long table where Gerald and his lawyer sat with forced confidence. The morning light came through the windows, harsh and unforgiving, exposing every crack in the vinyl booths, every stain on the carpet. No atmosphere to hide behind, just truth and fluorescent lighting. Kate stood at the front of the room, her hand steady despite the terror still living in her chest. She'd laid the 43 letters on the table, each one protected in its plastic sleeve, each annotation visible in her careful handwriting. Marcus Patterson stood beside her, his presence a shield she hadn't known she needed. "Mrs. Morrison will present first," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done this 100 times. Kate spoke with calm precision, the same voice she'd used to take orders for 30 years. "These letters were written by my grandfather, Sergeant James Morrison, during the Transcends siege in 1968. She held up the first one, dated January 28, 1968. "I began annotating them in 2018, 7 years ago, when my grandfather's Alzheimer's made it clear his memories would be lost forever." She showed the court reporter the dated annotations, the ink that had faded differently depending on age, the timeline she'd built year by year. "I didn't fabricate these letters. I preserved them." Donna stepped forward next, her phone connected to a portable speaker. "I've been recording my shifts for 2 years, she said, looking directly at Gerald. "After Mr. Finch made it clear that female employees were disposable when they inconvenienced wealthy customers." She pressed play. Gerald's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. "That man could buy this place 10 times over. You embarrassed him publicly." Then the sound of him confiscating Kate's phone, inventing a policy that didn't exist, coaching another employee on false testimony. Each recording landed like a blow. Walter Hayes stood slowly, leaning on his cane, his Marine Corps cap casting a shadow across his weathered face. "I served at Key San," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades. "Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines." He described the siege, the February 25th ambush that decimated Bravo Company's patrol, the heroism that kept men alive when death was the only logical outcome. "Sergeant Morrison's actions are documented in official Marine Corps records," Walter said. "This woman isn't inventing history. She's honoring it." A woman in a gray suit stood, Dr. Patricia Chin, representative from the National Archives. "We've authenticated Mrs. Morrison's letters," she said, placing a folder on the table. "Paper analysis, ink aging, historical cross-referencing with VA records, and Marine Corps documentation. These letters are not only genuine, they contain tactical intelligence that may have saved hundreds of lives during the March 1968 offensive at Khe Sanh. Her voice strengthened. They belong in our permanent collection as documentation of strategic heroism. Gerald's face had gone red, splotches of color climbing his neck. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "These are falsified," he shouted, his composure cracking. "She signed an employment agreement with confidentiality clauses about customers." He pointed at Kate with a shaking hand. "This is extortion. She's trying to manipulate Mr. Hewitt for money." Raymond Pierce, his lawyer, rose smoothly beside him. "My client has grounds for countersuit," Pierce said, his voice oily and confident. "Defamation, breach of contract, tortious interference." The door opened. Nathan Hewitt walked in, flanked by 3 attorneys in tailored suits and a man in a Department of Veterans Affairs uniform. The room went silent. Nathan's expression was cold. Controlled fury barely contained beneath business professionalism. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "you're facing federal charges of employee harassment, evidence tampering, and fraud." He placed a thick folder on the table between them. "Testimony from 14 former employees documenting your pattern of retaliation and termination to protect donor relationships." He opened the folder, revealing pages and pages of documentation. Audio recordings proving you fabricated complaints against Mrs. Morrison, and financial records showing you've embezzled veteran fundraiser donations for 3 years. Nathan's voice dropped lower, each word deliberate. $127,483.64 in stolen funds meant for community programs and veteran services. Gerald's face drained of all color, going from red to a sickly gray-white. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles bone-white. The platinum cufflinks he wore, purchased with money meant for veterans, caught the fluorescent light and glinted like an accusation. Nathan's lead attorney, a woman named Sarah Brennan, who'd made her career prosecuting white-collar crime, stepped forward with the methodical precision of someone dismantling a bomb. "Let's walk through the evidence systematically," she said, addressing the court reporter, but really speaking to Gerald. She opened the first section of the folder. Financial records from the Bronze Eagles veteran fundraiser accounts, 2022 through 2025. She projected them onto a portable screen, numbers appearing in stark black and white. $127,483.64 in what Mr. Finch labeled administrative fees. Charges that should have gone to the Flagstaff Veterans Community Fund, the Wounded Warrior Project, and local VA support programs. She highlighted specific line items. Money meant for housing assistance for homeless veterans, for PTSD counseling, for adaptive equipment for disabled service members. Her voice hardened. Money Mr. Finch diverted to his personal accounts and business expansion plans. The VA representative, Commander Michael Torres, stood with military bearing. Misappropriating veteran funds violates 18 U.S.C. Section 1024, fraudulent appropriation and misapplication of monies for veteran services. His voice carried the weight of official authority. It's a federal crime carrying penalties of up to 10 years imprisonment and substantial fines. He looked directly at Gerald. The Department of Veterans Affairs takes these violations extremely seriously. Sarah Brennan continued, pulling up email trails. In March 2023, Mr. Finch terminated employee Linda Chen after she suggested a regular customer might want to donate to a veteran's scholarship fund. She displayed the emails. Mr. Finch wrote to his assistant manager, "Get rid of her before she starts asking other customers for money. Can't risk the Whitfield donation." She pulled up another thread. October 2023. Employee Maria Delgado mentioned to a tech executive that she'd attended the same university. Mr. Finch fired her 3 days later, writing, "Too familiar with VIPs. Need staff who know their place." Walter Hayes spoke up, his cane tapping for emphasis. "The VFW has been investigating Mr. Finch for 18 months, he said. 3 separate complaints from veteran families about funds that never reached their intended programs." He handed over a document. "Our independent audit showed systematic misappropriation dating back to 2021. Sarah Brennan delivered the killing blow. Hyper-specific numbers that left no room for ambiguity. $2,847.19 charged to veteran fundraiser accounts for catering services from Delgado's restaurant on April 15, 2024. She paused. Delgado's restaurant closed in 2022. $4,156.88 for facility rental at the Flagstaff Convention Center on September 8, 2023. Another pause. The convention center has no record of Mr. Finch renting space that date. $1,923.45 for printing and promotional materials from Summit Graphics, August 2024. Summit Graphics confirms no such order was placed. She spread invoices across the table, fake receipts, forged signatures, fabricated vendor documentation. Each one a separate count of fraud, she said. Each one prosecutable under federal law. Gerald's hands shook uncontrollably now. Raymond Pierce had gone silent, his expensive confidence evaporating as he calculated the impossibility of defending this case. Two federal agents in plain clothes stepped forward from where they'd been standing by the door. Gerald Finch, one of them said, pulling out credentials. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of funds intended for veteran services. They read him his rights while the room watched in stunned silence. Gerald's platinum cufflinks, purchased with money stolen from veterans, glinted under the fluorescent lights as the agents fastened handcuffs around his wrists. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. A man who'd profited from other people's sacrifice, brought down by his own greed. After the federal agents led Gerald away, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Nathan remained standing at the front, his posture shifting from business professional to something more vulnerable. He looked at Kate, really looked at her, seeing past the uniform and the position to the person beneath. I need to say something, he began, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't trying to hide anymore. The lawyers, the court reporter, the community members, everyone went still. Catherine Morrison has more honor in her service apron than most people have in their entire lives. He took a breath, his hand unconsciously tracing the Purple Heart tattoo on his forearm. I was wrong, spectacularly, unforgivably wrong. His voice cracked slightly. I judged her by her position instead of her character. He looked around the room. I walked into this diner wearing my father's story like it made me special, like it gave me permission to be dismissive of someone who'd lived through her own war. Nathan's eyes shone with unshed tears. I became exactly what my father fought against, someone who measures worth by bank accounts instead of sacrifice. Kate stood with quiet dignity, her blazer pressed and perfect despite everything she'd survived to get to this moment. I didn't do this for recognition, she said, her voice steady and clear. I did it for my grandfather. She touched the Purple Heart certificate lying among the letters on the table. He gave everything so boys could come home and become fathers, so those fathers could raise sons. She looked at Nathan, so those sons could build empires and remember where they came from. Nathan crossed the space between them, no longer separated by tables or class or the invisible barriers that kept service workers and billionaires in different worlds. I'd like to meet him, he said softly. Your grandfather, if you'll allow it. His hand extended, not a business gesture anymore, but something more fundamental, an offer of connection. Kate's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for days. He doesn't remember much anymore, she said, her voice breaking. Most days, he doesn't even recognize me. The grief in those words was palpable. Nathan stepped closer. Then I remember for both of us, he said, his own tears finally falling. I'll carry his story forward the way he carried my father through hell. The handshake became an embrace, awkward at first, then genuine. Service worker and billionaire, granddaughter and son, two people united by a debt that was 57 years old, but felt as immediate as the morning light streaming through the diner windows. In that moment, every barrier dissolved. There was no wealth disparity, no class divide, no hierarchy of worth. Just two people honoring the connection that had always existed between their families, even when they didn't know each other's names. Walter Hayes stood, his cane tapping against the floor. This is what service looks like, he said quietly. Not the glory, not the medals. Just one generation honoring the sacrifice of another. The resolution came with concrete details. because justice without specificity is just sentiment. Marcus Patterson laid it out with the precision of a contract negotiation. Gerald Finch faced federal charges carrying 5 to 7 years imprisonment and up to $250,000 in fines. The multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of veteran funds meant consecutive sentencing was likely. His lawyer, Raymond Pierce, was under investigation by the state bar for fabricating evidence and suborning perjury. The cases Pierce had won using similar tactics were being reviewed. Kate received $18,400 in back wages and damages, $100 for each of the 184 days she'd worked unpaid overtime over 8 years, her hours conveniently forgotten by management when paychecks were calculated. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was acknowledgement, proof that her time had value. The Bronze Eagle Diner was sold within 60 days to a veteran-owned cooperative, former service members who understood what it meant to serve in a different way. They offered Kate the position of Director of Operations at $58,000 annually plus full benefits, health insurance, and a retirement plan. The title came with respect built into the job description. Gerald's professional licenses were revoked, his food service permits, his business registration, his ability to operate any establishment that served the public. He would never own a restaurant again. The embezzled veteran fundraiser donations were recovered from Gerald's personal accounts and business holdings. Every dollar was redistributed to its intended programs: housing for homeless veterans, counseling services, adaptive equipment, scholarships for military families. The Flagstaff Veterans Community Fund received its full allocation. The Wounded Warrior Project got the money Gerald had stolen. 3 local veterans finally received the emergency housing assistance they'd been promised 18 months earlier. Justice, when it finally came, was measured in dollars and years and restored dignity. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. If this story of justice and dignity moved you, subscribe now. We share 3 new stories every week of ordinary people who proved the powerful wrong. Stories of waitresses and mechanics and nurses who stood up when standing up cost everything. Stories of communities that rallied when one person refused to be silent. Your support helps us tell these stories, helps us prove that honor isn't determined by bank accounts or job titles. It's determined by what you do when the cost of truth exceeds what you can afford to pay. The Memory Care Sunrise facility in Flagstaff smelled like lavender and old photographs. Artificial pleasantness layered over the reality of minds slowly disappearing into fog. Kate had visited every Tuesday and Thursday for 5 years, watching her grandfather fade increment by increment, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. She knew the routine. Sign in at the desk. Walk past the common room, where elderly residents sat staring at television shows they wouldn't remember watching. Find her grandfather in his wheelchair by the window, his eyes distant and unfocused. But today was different. Nathan Hewitt sat in the common room in jeans and a flannel shirt, looking nothing like the billionaire who'd walked into the Bronze Eagle 6 months ago. He held a framed photograph carefully in his lap. 2 young Marines at Key Sand, arms slung around each other's shoulders, faces young and whole and alive. His father, Daniel Hewitt, and Sergeant Jimmy Morrison, 1968. The National Archives had found it in a donated collection, part of a combat photographer's private papers that had been gathering dust for 50 years. Jimmy Morrison, 89 years old now, sat in his wheelchair with a blanket tucked around his legs despite the warm spring morning. His eyes were distant, lost somewhere between memory and void. Most days he didn't recognize Kate. Most days he didn't speak at all. The Alzheimer's had taken almost everything: names, faces, the timeline of his own life. But Nathan had asked to try anyway. He knelt beside Jimmy's wheelchair, the photograph held where the old man could see it. "Sir," Nathan said quietly, his voice carrying the respect reserved for heroes. "My name is Nathan Hewitt. My father was Daniel Hewitt, radio operator, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines." He paused, watching for any flicker of recognition. "You saved his life on February 25th, 1968, at Key Sand." For a long moment, nothing. Jimmy's eyes stayed unfocused, his face slack. Kate's heart sank. She'd warned Nathan this might happen, that the grandfather who'd written those letters, who'd pulled men from burning earth, was gone. Only the shell remained. But then something flickered in Jimmy's eyes, something deep and ancient. buried beneath years of neurological decay. His weathered hand, scarred from decades of construction work, trembling with age, reached toward the photograph. His fingers touched the glass over Daniel Hewitt's young face. "Radio," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Tears welled in his clouded eyes. "You made it home, son." He'd confused Nathan with his father, but the recognition was real. Somewhere in the ruins of Jimmy Morrison's mind, the memory of that night survived. The darkness, the weight of earth, the radio operator he'd pulled from death. Nathan's tears fell freely, splashing onto the photograph's glass. "Because of you, sir," he said, his voice breaking. "Because of you, he made it home. He raised me. He taught me what honor means." He took Jimmy's trembling hand in both of his. "I exist because you didn't give up when it would have been easier to let him die." Kate stood against the wall, her own tears falling silent and unchecked. This was what she'd wanted. Not money, not recognition. Just this, her grandfather seeing even for a moment, that his sacrifice had mattered, that the boy he'd saved had lived and loved and created a legacy of his own. 3 days later, Kate stood in her kitchen, staring at an envelope. It had arrived that morning, forwarded through the diner's new management. The return address was Tucson, Arizona. Her mother's handwriting, the first communication in 17 years. The estrangement had started when Kate married Tom against her mother's wishes. "You're throwing your life away on a soldier who'll come home broken." It had deepened when Kate refused to institutionalize her grandfather earlier. "He doesn't even remember who you are. You're sacrificing yourself for nothing." And it had calcified into permanent silence when Kate wouldn't accept financial help after Tom's death. Pride is a luxury you can't afford. Now, her mother wanted to visit, wanted to reconcile, wanted to meet the billionaire who'd honored her father, see the letters she'd demanded Kate throw away years ago, claim some piece of a story she tried to bury. Kate placed the unopened envelope next to her grandfather's Purple Heart certificate, both sitting on her kitchen table in the morning light. 17 years of silence couldn't be solved with a letter. Or could it? Some conversations required preparation. Some wounds needed time before they could be examined without bleeding fresh. She would open it, eventually, but not today. The Bronze Eagle's grand reopening as the Bronze Eagle Veterans Community Hub drew a crowd that spilled out onto the sidewalk. The new owners, a cooperative of 7 veterans from 3 different wars, had transformed the space while keeping its soul. The same vinyl booths, the same Formica countertops. But now the walls held photographs of local veterans, their stories written in simple, dignified language. Kate, wearing a blazer instead of an apron, her title reading Director of Operations on the name tag she designed herself, watched a nervous young waitress serve her first table. A wealthy tech investor from Phoenix made a dismissive comment about the service being slow, his tone carrying that familiar condescension Kate knew too well. She appeared before the situation could escalate. "Accidents happen to the best servers," she said warmly, handing the investor her business card. "Call me if you need anything addressed." She paused. "Or if you're looking for community investment opportunities. We're always seeking partners who understand that service comes in many forms." The investor looked at the card, noticed her title, and his expression shifted from irritation to interest. "Director of Operations?" He reassessed her with new eyes. "I'd like to hear more about your programs." Walter Hayes, sitting at his regular table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, smiled into his cup. He'd been right all along. Powerful people don't respect fear. They respect competence delivered with dignity. And Kate Morrison had both in abundance. The Arizona sunset painted the mountains amber and gold, the same colors as the Purple Heart medal tattooed on Nathan Hewitt's arm. Kate stood at the window of her grandfather's room in the memory care facility, watching a young woman in a server's uniform walk to her car after what had clearly been a long shift, shoulders hunched, feet dragging, exhausted in the way only service work exhausts. Kate had been there. She'd survived it. And now, with resources and power she'd never imagined having, she'd make sure others did too. The Purple Heart tattoo on Nathan's arm had unlocked more than a story. It had proven that honor transcends time, class, and circumstance. That sacrifice connects generations in ways that wealth never can. That some debts take 57 years to repay, but they're worth every moment of the wait. Some connections are worth fighting for, even when fighting costs everything. Especially then. Thank you for watching Kate's story. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for new stories of dignity, justice, and triumph every week. You never know who needs to hear these words.